Hey everyone, so welcome to this new tutorial or tutorial series. This is a long time coming, and the idea for this project is that we're going to use Python Django, so Django being the web framework, which uses Python to help create a backend and in some instances templates of a front end. And what we want to do is replicate a website like this one, so IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, which is a website which allows, well, the website itself has, um, films, TV series, and it allows users to sort of log on as a member, as a user, to rate films that they have watched, by adding their rating, obviously, and it gives details about the film. So details such as the type of film it is, who stars in the film, duration, release date, and so on and so forth. So we want to use Django to recreate this, and this will probably happen over a series of sessions. What I've done here is using Notion. I've got a notepad here on Notion, which just details a bunch of things I've thought to myself, this will probably happen as we go along. And I haven't listed everything down, but I'm going to link this site in the comments and in the comments. And the idea is that as we go along, I'll have screenshots and code snippets that you can copy. So, for example, creating a virtual environment, there are screenshots involved on some of these things, and just explaining how to do stuff, so you can work along and sort of pick stuff as you go along, knowing that you've done it. So this first video is about how to set up a virtual environment, or how to set up the Django project, and that obviously includes how to install Python and Visual Studio, so you've got a good coding environment, how to create a GitHub repository, how to create a virtual environment, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute, and how to install the Django software, and how to create a Django project. So this will get us started. So this first video is our start video, just to create your virtual environment, get you started, and then from there on we'll continue, hopefully. If there's things I haven't thought about here, and I'm doing this project alongside a lunch club that I run on Wednesdays with my students. And if there's anything we haven't thought of that they can add, or if you want, you can add in the comments as we go along. Hopefully, we'll update this list. This is a live list, and we can always make changes to it as we go along. So do drop some comments in there if you feel that there's anything I've missed out going along. And this can be rejigged as well. So anyway, without further ado, let's carry on. To get started, I've already got Python and Visual Studio Basic installed on my system, but I'm going to do this in a virtual window, in a sandbox. So basically, Windows has a virtual sandbox that I can use, and it allows us to sort of have a working environment with no software installed. And so I can show you then, how we do every step. So our first step is we're going to install Python and Visual Studio. So I have the Python website opened up. So Python being our programming language, I'm just going to download the latest version of Python, 3.12 at this point. And as we install it, okay, it's important to say at this point, you shouldn't just click on install. You should also add Python to path, and I always add admin privileges as well. So path basically adds some functionality to Python. Python comes built in with some scripts, mainly. It comes with the ability to install other software from the web, and for it to have permission to do this, we need to click on add Python to path, which basically gives Windows the path to where that software should be installed. So now I'm going to click on install, having added it to path. Cool. So that's done, and I'm saying this retrospectively, but that was sped up, so yours might take a few minutes. And any other time I'm installing something here, I am speeding the video up, so you'll see things finish immediately, very quickly, but this is being sped up a little bit. Anyway, so Python's installed. Our next step is we're going to install Visual Studio for Windows. And so the installer's downloaded. Yep, that's fine. Accept the agreement. Next. And you may want to do this on your system, so you might want to add open with code to Windows Files Explorer. And so that enables you that when you click on any file, if it's a file that Visual Studio Code can work with, you can right click, and let's add it to desktop as well. And it will enable you to edit the file using Visual Studio Code. Cool. So that's done as well. Now when we open VS Code, let's make that slightly larger. This doesn't matter too much because for me, this environment is going to be deleted. When we click on the Explorer window here, it doesn't give me the option to copy or clone a GitHub repository. So this may not make much sense just yet. We'll explain in just a moment. But something called Git or GitHub is kind of built in. Git is built into Windows to Visual Studio Code, but it's not installed at the get-go. So the Git program isn't installed in my version of Windows. Obviously, I'm using a sandbox. And if you've never done this, yours wouldn't be either. So I'm going to click on Open here. It will open the web page for us to download the Git software. Now, Git is basically a versioning software, which allows us to, I'm going to do a lot of next here. You don't have to do anything else other than next. Done. So Git then is Git is a piece of versioning software which allows us to synchronize our code on our local desktop with a repository online. In other words, a folder online where our work is kept. And the great thing about doing that is our work is versioned. And if we want to have a second version of our work, so for example, if we want to change our project and try something new, we get to create different branches with that same project that we've been working on, and it doesn't ruin the first branch, the original branch. And then we can decide if we want to merge the two together, then it makes it easy to do that. So it's great, and I always recommend my students will do that because while they're working on their projects, if something was to happen to their laptop or their computer, their work is always synchronized in a repository online. And as I'm going to show you in a bit, everything can be resynchronized to your new computer or whatever computer you're working on, as if you were working on it, as if it was exactly the way it was when you were working on it last on a different computer. Right, so we've got Git installed as well. So now if we open up Visual Studio Code again, it still says that, so I probably have to shut this down and reopen it. So let's just shut down Visual Studio Code, minimize that for a second, and it should be here on my desktop. So now that I've reopened it, it now gives me this option to clone a repository. So the next step we're going to take is, if I go back to Explorer here, or Edge, I'm going to create a repository online. So if you haven't done this, create yourself a GitHub account. Okay. My one's created. I'm just going to click on the plus button here to create a repository. Like I said, this is like an online folder where I'm going to store my code. So I'm going to say new repository, and I'm going to call this repository build IMDb. I think it has to be all lowercase, 2023. Oops, that's wrong, 2023. I could give the project a small description. So a clone of IMDb, and I'm going to include a README file. And the reason why I'm going to do this is this is going to be the first file that's going to be in the repository. And when I clone it, you're going to see that it's going to make a copy of this. So this is done. If I just scroll down and create repository. So this is now my online folder, my online directory, and this is the only file inside it. So for us to clone our repository, we're going to click on code, and we're going to click on copy. This is the HTTPS link, so the web link for this repository. And I'm going to go back to VS Code, and I'm going to go to clone repository, and it asks me to paste my repository link here. So I'm going to paste it in and hit enter. And now it's now asking me where I want to store my work. So I'm going to click on documents. I'm just going to say in my documents, for example, this is where I want my repository to be. Obviously you can store wherever. And it asks me if I want to reopen VS Code with that directory now loaded. So I'm going to click open. And as you can see, let's trust authors. Now that README file is it's basically open that directory, build IMDb, and this is the file that we had created a second ago. And so now we're going to continue. What's our next step actually? Let's go back to here. So we've installed Python and Visual Studio Code. We've created a GitHub repository. Our next step is we're going to create a virtual environment. Let's talk about what a virtual environment is. Actually, I told you I was working in Windows Sandbox. Windows Sandbox is a virtual environment. Basically, it allows me to do any changes to my system, and any software that I install doesn't affect my whole computer. So this is very useful when we're coding. So if I go back to Visual Studio Code, at the bottom of the window, if I highlight over the bottom, the status bar, you can see it turns blue. If I grab that, just click and drag up, it opens up a terminal window or command line interface. And so what this allows me to do is use Python now. If you remember, when we installed Python, we added Python to path in our environment settings. And so that basically now allows me now in the command line interface or terminal to run this Python command, this pip, which is basically an installer. It's like a repository online with lots of different software scripts, and it allows me to install software using this. So I'm going to install virtual env, which is the name of the software. Oops, it's not going to work if I don't type in install. So now it's going to install this software using Python. So this software is now installed on the system. And now I want to activate this virtual box. So what this is going to do is, this is going to create a sandbox that is only applicable to this folder, this directory that I'm working in. So if I install any software here, it doesn't install it to the whole system. It's not my whole laptop or my whole computer it's going to install it to. Let's say, for example, I'm working on a version of Python or a version of Django or a version of any software that I'm working on. And let's say I'm working on this now, it's 2023. In 2 years' time, if I'm going to build a new project, some of those scripts might be updated. But when I come back to work on this project, I might want to work on the same versions of the software that installed at the point that I was making this project. As software updates, sometimes there are new ways of doing things. So sometimes the commands change, and there are new, some features of that software might be deprecated, or new features might be included. And if I just want to work on the current version I'm working on right now, and if I want that project to work exactly how it does today in 2 years' time, then I'm going to use this sandbox so that when I load my project up, I load it with the exact same settings, the exact same software as it was when I first worked on it, unless I want to update myself manually later. Anyway, having said that, we've installed virtual env, and now I want to use the command virtual env to run that software and create a virtual environment called env. So if I enter, so it's done that for me, and you can see here now that there's a directory, an extra folder here created called env, and this now will store scripts and library items of any other software that I'm going to download. This is going to be my virtual sandbox. Okay, so anything installed now will install in this folder and not my whole Windows machine. However, that needs to be activated. So at the moment it's not activated. You can see here at the bottom of my command line, it says PS. Okay, I need to activate that. When I do, you'll see that it's in brackets that say env, which means that any installation I do now will install in my virtual environment and not my whole computer. I've said that probably half a dozen times already. So the problem is though, is when I go to activate now, you'll see, I'm going to say env script. So inside the env folder, inside the scripts folder, we want to run the software by clicking, by running activate. It won't happen because basically if you're using Windows will block scripts from running on your computer in case it thinks that there's some kind of malicious script that's being run. And we can circumvent that. I'm just going to say cannot load it because scripts is disabled on your system. Let's copy that text and let's go back to the browser. And if I just Google that, actually the first result that comes up on Stack Overflow is a solution for that, which I'm just going to run. There we go. I'm just going to run that command in PowerShell. So if I go back to here and just paste that in, now that that's run, if I click on up on my keyboard twice, so it scrolls through the last software, that last instruction that I typed in. If I now click on enter, it's now run the script. So you can see here I've got env in brackets. So that means that anything I install now is in a virtual box. I've said that so much. I'm sorry. I apologize to you all. Right. So we've done that. We've installed our virtual environment. Let's go back to here for a second. We can close that, or you can close that. We can go to here. So we've created our virtual environment. Now we want to install Django. So Django is going to be the first software that we install. Right, so let's continue by running our first script. In fact, I'll actually use this window here. If I go to install Django, I've got the script here. And so again, we're using that Python installer to install this add-on, this Python add-on called Django. And if I just copy that, actually, I should be able to go to I should be able to go back to my Visual Studio Code, hit enter once I've pasted it in, and now we'll start installing Django. Oh yeah, there's two other things I wanted to do. I'll come back to that in a second. So I've installed Django. So that software now, if we go to our virtual environment, it's not installed on all my windows. It's actually installed here in my library of software installed. Okay. Okay, so two things I'm going to do. If I go to extensions, I'm going to install the Python extension. Just install Python. So the Python linter basically helps us with code completion. It helps us with giving us tips when we're writing software. So when we're writing code, and I just think that's very useful. So if I'm not sure sometimes how a function works, by hovering over it, it gives me tips. So that's a very useful first piece of software to install. While that's installing, actually, I'm just going to install the next part as well. I'm going to search for material icon. And the reason why I do this is, as that installs, and I'll explain in a second. So that's installed a lot quicker. And it now enables me to pick the material icon theme. So as I've done that, if I go back to the Explorer window here, you can see that now my folders and files have icons. And so every time I create a file, it will associate it with an icon that represents that particular file type, which I just think visually looks a bit nicer. Anyway, that's done as well. Has Python installed? We go to, I delete that. Installed. I can see that Python is now installed as well, I believe. Yes, it is. All right, cool. So that's done as well. And we had just installed Django. And so our next step is we want to start a Django project. And this is where we're going to end this video, more or less, actually. So what I've shown you here is how to install the software, make your coding environment, and how to start a Django project. I'm actually going to continue this video with also, what if I've already got a project in my GitHub repository? Because we did say this. We said that what if you were to lose your laptop, or your laptop was to break, or your computer was to break, and you needed to continue your project on another computer. I'm now going to show you how to do that as well. So let's start with the project first. So we've installed Django. If we go back to here, let's go to create a Django project, and I'll explain what this does as well. So if I copy that code in, Django-admin is now a command from the Django software, and we're going to run an additional optional command, which is start project. So we're going to start a project, and we're going to give the project a name, and then there's a trailing dot, and I'll explain what that is. If we go back to here for a second, what that means is it's going to start a new project. That project will have a name, sort of a directory will appear, but the dot basically means that it will not be in another new folder of its own. That's one folder deeper. It's going to create it in this particular root. That's what the dot means, in this particular directory. So let's give the project a name. I'm going to call it core. And that's because I want, when I refer to core, this is quite common. What we're referring to is the core of the software. So this is the actual Django software. And if you can see, as I've installed it now, there's this new file here with manage.py. And this is basically, it's a bunch of functions to help us sort of, which comes with a bunch of commands when we're running Django commands. It makes more sense. And the core folder will hold things like URL patterns and settings, and we'll come back to what those are in just a minute. So the settings, well, I suppose I'll explain now. The settings tells us all about our particular installation of Django. So for example, where our static files are going to be kept. We'll make more sense of static files later. The language, so for example, language code, I'm in Britain, so I'm going to say GB. So English, it's going to be English. That makes sense. UTC is going to be, you know, central universal time. Is it universal time? I believe. So it's going to be Greenwich Maritime, I believe. It has information about, you know, where we're going to connect, what database it's going to connect to. And that can change if you're going to use a different database. You can update that. And there's a bunch of other things, like, for example, a directory where all our templates are going to be for our web pages. We'll add that later. And things like installed apps. So Django is great because it comes built in with so many features. You know, two of the great features here is the fact that it's got an administrator page built in with its own dashboard. It's got authentication built in, and Django is, you know, it's used by some of the biggest companies in the world because it's such a secure piece of open source software. It was relied on by, for example, Instagram before Facebook had purchased it. I don't know if they still use Django. I know that Pinterest uses it, YouTube uses it, and loads. So, I mean, if you go to their webpage, you'll find that there's probably more examples. Anyway, so we've created our core project, and this will almost be the last part of this. Now what I'm going to do is, now that that software is installed, I'm going to run a piece of code called pip freeze, and we're going to say pip freeze into requirements.txt. So what this does now is this created a new file called requirements, and this basically tells my repository, if I'm going to install it on another computer, what requirements are required to run this software exactly as it is on my system. Okay, so I know that I need Django, and I need version 4.2.7, and there's a bunch of other software that Django relies on. These are sort of associated apps, and we're going to add a whole bunch more as we're running this program. This is going to keep building up. But the great thing now is, let's save that and close it. Now you can see that I've updated 7 files. So by creating this Django project, if I go to here, it says here that these files were created, and I'm just going to commit these. So I first save, and if I click on commit, what this does, oh, okay, yes, good thing I did this. All right, so it says there are no stage commits. Would you like to stage all changes and commit them directly? Yes. Okay, good. So because I haven't got a username and login on my system here for VS Code, it's going to tell me how to do that. If I click on open git log, it gives me 2 scripts I have to run. So in my terminal, this is in the output, by the way, I'm going to go back to terminal in a second, and I'm going to run this line here with my in terminal. And I'm going to, if I just copy that, I'll show you what I mean. I go to there and I run that. I've got to replace this with my the email that I signed into GitHub with. And then afterwards, I'm also going to copy the second line that says my username or my name. This will make more sense in a second, but I'm going to do this off recording, and I'll come back once I've done it and I've cleared my terminal printout. And this is basically going to connect our Visual Studio session here, or our Visual Studio Code. It's going to connect it with our GitHub account so that we can synchronize our files. So let me just pause and I'll do that, and then you'll do the same hopefully. Okay, so now that I've done that, I've cleared my terminal, and you can now see that if I was to go back here and I was to save my first save and I commit it, it's now gonna queue those to synchronize with GitHub. So when I click on sync changes, this action will create a pull and push commits from the original, or the origin and main, which basically means my main branch on GitHub. So now when we synchronize that, it's going to ask me to sign in through my browser. So let's do that. And I was already signed in through my browser, so authentication succeeded. I can now close the tab. And if we go back to here, yeah, let's do that. So now it's synchronized. If I go back to GitHub again, so if we go back to that window here, so this was the repository that we created. If you remember, it was just that README file. There it is. If I refresh this, it now tells me that it's synchronized and I now have these files here. Okay, cool. So having done that, let's now show you how to replicate this work. So let's say, for example, I lost my system and I don't want to sit here and write all this code out again. So let's say, for example, that let's have a new window. Let's close the original one. And let's say, for example, that I lost my laptop, or I could, something happened to my system and I needed to reinstall. So what I'm going to do now is, well, I suppose exactly the same thing that I did before. But here's the thing. So if I go back to GitHub and I copy the code again, let's make a copy of it. And let's go back to Visual Studio Code. If I clone that repository now, I'm going to do the same thing. And it's going to ask me where I want to save it. I'm going to save it in the same place. It's actually going to give it a different name. So it will say build IMDb 2023. And it will just add something to it. Let's open that. It's added a -1. Okay. So here's the thing. I mean, we already did this earlier. But the good thing about this now is if I'm going to start somewhere new, I showed you how to set up that requirements, right? So obviously the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new virtual environment for this particular folder. We'll do the same thing again, virtual env. And let's now activate that virtual environment. So we're going to say env/scripts/activate. And now that our virtual environment is activated, now what I want to do is install this setup, this software that I had begun to work on. I want to get it prepared so it was exactly like the other folder and all the requirements are set up already. So here I'm going to say pip install our requirements.txt. So now what it will do is it will download all the items that are in my list of software that's part of my requirements. And now it's added those to my environment here. If I was to look at the library, you can see Django's now being installed to this new version. And the other dependent software as well that Django required. So having done that, now we have our setup completely ready, and you should know how to set up your virtual environment, how to install Django, and then how to restore your project onto a new computer if you need to. Okay. So I'll end this there, and then we'll start looking at the next step. Thank you.